And here I am. 2 years after my depressing affair, a year and a half after my divorce, 1 year of therapy, 22 words into writing my story, and I think I have writer's block. I told Dr. Thompson that I'm not a writer by nature, but he insisted. His idea, minus the psychiatric nonsense, is that by telling my life story, I can find a way to move it forward. Like my life is a fairy tale. As if I'm just a character. As if by writing about the worst mistake I've ever made, I can write myself a happy ending. Seems like bullshit to me, but Thompson is the one with the PhD and a 4.8 rating on Google reviews, and I'm the one who hired him, so I guess I should give him everything I've got. That said, there's no way in hell anyone will see this, including the good doctor. It's one thing to admit your ugliness and cruelty to yourself, usually at 1 o'clock in the morning, with a glass of white in your hand and 3 more in your stomach. But it's quite another to lance that wound in a beige room with Mondrian prints on the wall and a guy who looks like William H. Macy sitting across from you. Macy sitting across from you. This story is not about the proud moments of my life. It's about dark days, stupid decisions, and regrets. A lot of regrets. As for my happy ending, forget about it. Clarity won't change the past, and it won't change what my life is now. For some mistakes, there is no going back to the way things were, no release from the oxen. There is only honesty, regret, and, hopefully, understanding. At least, that's what I'm praying for. Because I desperately want to know why. Next chapter. The thing is, I have a quirk. Or rather, not a condition. More like a bit of a problem. I love cleanliness. When I was a kid, it was a problem. I grew up in a house full of boys, so for as long as I can remember, I was surrounded by dirt. Dirty dishes, dirty clothes, dirty sports equipment and football cleats strewn all over the house. My parents cleaned up as best they could, and as I got older, I helped too. But as fast as we cleaned up, my brothers cleaned up even faster. My parents threatened and punished, but even I knew they were soft-pedaling. I think my brothers tried to clean up after themselves, but it was always, "I'll just leave my mitten here for a minute," or "I swear I'll clean my shoes later." With 4 boys, a few minutes here, and a few minutes later there turned the living room into a living room that looked like a city dump. Because of my cleanliness issues and my brother's dirt issues, I was effectively banished from the living room, kitchen, and any other room the boys occupied. Fortunately, there was one place in the house where I could always hide from the mess: my bedroom. But I wasn't entirely comfortable there either. My mom, excited about finally having a daughter, had decorated it in her version of the perfect little girl's room: pink 4-poster bed, lampshades, lace curtains, and ornate provincial-style furniture. For me, it was a different kind of clutter, a slightly more acceptable form of clutter. Needless to say, I was not a fan of it. I longed for clean lines, barren surfaces, neutral shades. When I turned 9, the official age for choosing bedroom furniture in the Collins household, I devised a plan to transform my mom's girly gulag into my ideal fortress of solitude. The first step was a trip to IKEA. Oh, IKEA. This is where I wish I was a better writer. I wish I had words to express the joy I feel when I walk into IKEA. I am reminded of a quote by Alex DeLarge. "Oh, bliss, bliss and paradise. Oh, it was splendor and luxury in the flesh. It was like a bird of the rarest celestial metal or silver wine flowing in a spaceship. Gravity is all nonsense now. When I floated, I imagined such beautiful pictures." Of course, Alex was a fictional gangster musing about Beethoven, and I was a disgraced divorcee musing about Swedish furniture, but the spirit is the same. I'm sure I don't have a drop of Scandinavian blood in me, but my little teenage heart was beating with delight as I strolled through the store's perfect little bedrooms, each meticulously furnished with the perfect amount of minimalist furniture. Everywhere I looked, there were straight lines and uncluttered spaces. Honestly, IKEA still makes my heart race. I spent most of the month leading up to my birthday drooling over the IKEA website, so before we even got in the car, I had already picked everything out. An hour after we went into the store, my parents and I walked out of there with a Billy bookcase, a perfect little Einal desk, and a retentive bed with drawers for all my toys and art supplies. In the basket, we also found a set of pre-vert panel blinds and an interrogator LED table lamp. A few hours of banging, screwing, and swearing, and my bedroom was ready. Looking at her, my eyes filled with light and my vision blurred. It was perfect. My father and I had created an oasis, a place of spotless surfaces and bright lighting, pastel colors, and industrial low-pile carpet. Everything is clean, everything in its place. I finally have the sanctuary I've been dreaming of. Of course, like any other sanctuary, there were uninvited guests waiting outside the gates. In my case, the barbarian horde consisted of my brothers, Ethan, Logan, Brendan, and Liam. I took precautions. I made the requisite "no boys allowed" sign on my door. To prove I was serious, I ditched the traditional pink color and printed it in a blood-red font with white Arial bold letters in 36-point size. And just in case they still think I'm kidding, I also signed it "I'm serious" in 14-point script MT bold letters at the bottom. It seemed to work. The barbarians stayed out of my room most of the time. There wasn't much of interest there for a teenage boy, and I'm sure the intrusive odor and the persistent odor of antiseptic spray upset their delicate sensibilities. When Brendan said my bedroom looked like an operating room, I nearly cried with gratitude. It was one of the few times with my brothers that I felt seen. In retrospect, I don't think he meant it as a compliment. Ethan, my older brother, was the first invader to break through the gate. His attack was caused by a pretty bad oral fixation. He had it pretty bad. It later developed into a pretty serious smoking habit. But at 15, he limited himself to chewing on things he found around the house. Things like pencil tips, pink erasers, and my Barbies. And apparently, chewing on my Barbies while watching reruns of Friends was just the thing to help Ethan relax after a long day of school and football practice. I discovered this habit of Ethan's when I tried to put on a pair of particularly cute Louboutin slip-on shoes on my endless summer Barbie, but they fell off time after time. Upon closer inspection, I discovered that Endless Summer no longer has toes. Before we go any further, a quick note about Barbie. Colombian musician Kali Uchis once said, "I'm not a Barbie doll. I'm just a multi-dimensional human being who likes to create things." I believe Kali Uchis can go screw herself. I know. Knee-jerk feminists tell us that Barbie is a terrible role model for little girls, causing them all sorts of eating disorders, high-heel addiction, and obsession with RuPaul's Drag Race show. I respectfully disagree. Barbie is an underrated feminist icon. She's been a lawyer and a judge, a firefighter and a police officer, an astronaut and a president. She can do any job, overcome any challenge. And no matter what she does, she always has the right closet, tailored to her, admittedly. Unconventional body type. Every accessory is perfectly suited to her style, perfectly tailored to her figure, perfectly adapted to her needs. She is the toy of all toys, and despite her unhealthy obsession with the color pink, she is the perfect role model for any little girl and any aspiring drag queen. I still dream of Barbie's life, and I'm almost 30 years old now. When I discovered Barbie's legs were messed up, I ran to my mom, who yelled at Ethan, who pouted and resented me. Nothing happened for a few days, and then there was the stewardess dream Barbie with teeth marks on her toes. It all happened again, only now all 4 of my brothers were laughing at me for being a jabberwock. By the time Moondream Barbie's feet were in Ethan's mouth, I realized that whining to Mom wasn't going to help, and I took it to the next level. I went to my dad's office. I walked into Dad's office, the dejected gait I portrayed whenever I wanted my parents to know I was really upset. Dad, immersed in his computer, waved me over and sat me down in a comfortable chair at the other end of the room, completely oblivious to my Oscar-winning performance. While Dad finished his work, I looked around. The office wasn't as clean and organized as my room. There were knickknacks on the bookshelves and a few stray stickers stuck to the desk. But underneath the cozy, lived-in atmosphere, I discerned a well-thought-out scheme. Everything my dad needed was at his fingertips. Printer next to paper, paper next to pens, pens next to him. I would have been a little harder on eliminating clutter, but I respected planning and organization. "Hey, Pumpkin," he said, finally looking up. Then he caught my facial expression, especially my lower lip, which bulged out enough to deserve its own zip code. "Hey, what's that?" I'd been holding back for a long time, so it all came out. "It's Ethan, Daddy. He keeps eating Barbie's toes." Dad's face turned red, and his mouth slammed shut. Seeing his expression, I felt vindicated. He, like me, was clearly stunned by the cruelty my dolls had been subjected to. Emboldened, I continued. "What should I do, Dad? Barbie's shoes keep falling off." Dad bit his lip and his eyes seemed to be watering. I felt a wave of kinship. Daddy understood. He hiccuped, said something inarticulately comforting, and hugged me. I could feel him trembling. I'd barely had time to tell him about Ethan's abuse of Barbie, and he was already crying. After holding me in his arms for about a minute longer, he pulled away and looked at me, his cheeks flushed, and his eyes filled with unshed tears. He sighed and smiled softly at me. "What do you want to do about it, sweetheart?" "I want Ethan to stop, Daddy. And I want to fix my Barbie's toes." Daddy nodded. "Well, fixing your Barbies isn't that hard. Just bring them to me tonight, and I'll see what I can do." Then his expression turned serious. "Fixing Ethan, on the other hand, might be a little more difficult. I assume you've already talked to your mom about it." I nodded. "And what did she say?" I folded my arms across my chest. "She yelled at Ethan. Then he did it again, and I told Mom, and she yelled at him again, and he did it again." He leaned back in his chair. "Sounds like the truth to me. Your brothers are a bit stubborn." He sighed. "And I guess you figured she'd probably talk to him, he'd probably apologize, and then it would start all over again?" I nodded again. Dad looked thoughtful, then leaned over to me. "Pumpkin, have you ever heard the saying that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results?" I shook my head. "Albert Einstein said that. He was a very smart guy. I bet you can guess what that means, can't you?" "I guess it means that if something doesn't work, you shouldn't keep doing it?" He stroked my head. "That's exactly what it means, kiddo. So if Mommy tells Ethan to stop, it won't make him stop, right?" He smiled at me, and I felt warmly happy. I loved it when Daddy talked to me like an adult, asking me questions and really listening to my answers. It made me feel important and in control. "I'm sorry, Pumpkin, but there's not much I can do that your mom hasn't done. We can punish Ethan. In fact, I'm sure he'll pay for your next batch of Barbies, but he'll probably continue to chew on Barbie's fingers." My brother's taunts of crybaby finished me off, and I didn't want to whine, at least not in front of Daddy, but the injustice was stronger than I could hold in. "But it's not fair." Dad sighed. "No, it's not fair. Sometimes things aren't fair." He paused for a moment and looked at me as if he were measuring me, deciding if I was ready for the harsh truth. I sat up straighter and looked him in the eye. "Honey, look on the bright side," he said. "If yelling at Ethan doesn't work and punishment doesn't work, then you have to find something that will work. How did Ethan find your Barbies?" "I left them in the TV room." His mouth pressed into a straight line. "So, let's get this straight. Ethan was in the TV room, probably watching CSI or something." "Friends." He nodded. "Okay, Friends. So he's watching Friends and sees your Barbie on the floor. Being in a chewing mood, he decides to pick her up and try her toes. Seems about right?" I felt my face frown. "Yeah." Dad rubbed his chin. "And what if Barbie hadn't been on the floor? What do you think he would have done then?" I blinked. I don't know. Maybe he would have found something else to chew on?" He smiled slightly. "I think so too." He pulled me up onto his lap and hugged me. "Look, I know it's awful that your brother is ruining your Barbies, and it's even more awful that you have to find a way to fix the problem yourself. But now is the time to learn something important. Sometimes you're the one who has to solve the problems that are bothering you. So what are you going to do? Take out my Barbies? He nodded. Maybe make a special place for them? He smiled at me like I was a genius. That sounds like a good idea. Maybe one of the drawers in your new bed could be a Barbie drawer? I nodded. The idea was pretty appealing. Truth be told, I was into Barbie because of the accessories. She had all of them. And I could easily envision turning one of my drawers into the perfect post-apocalyptic style Barbie closet /stash/ fashion bunker. I was already envisioning rows of Tupperware containers, each filled with different clothing items, beauty products, or accessories. How would I organize them by color? By size? By number of items? My head was spinning with the possibilities that were opening up. I smiled at my dad. Thank you, Daddy. I'll go check it out right away. Anytime, pumpkin. 2 days later, I had all the new Barbies Ethan had paid for. Each one had a full set of toes, and they lay in their hideout in neat rows, like perfect little soldiers dozing in their molded plastic sarcophagi. And, as I had envisioned, their accessories were stacked in stacks of matching plastic containers, from IKEA, that I mostly arranged by size, though I occasionally changed them by purpose. And sometimes by color, too. Everything was perfect. At least until a week later, when I discovered Barbie Malibu Dream without half of her legs on the TV room floor. I froze. What had happened? Had I left her unattended? Had I failed to protect my Barbie from the barbarian at the gate? I ran to my room. It looked pretty much the same, but I noticed that Barbie's crate was open and the sheet was pulled up. My face grew warm. There was no way I was going to let the sheet get caught like that. My hands clenched into fists. Ethan had tracked her down. I remembered my conversation with my father. Fighting wasn't going to help me. Neither would getting Ethan to pay for new dolls. My Barbie bunker was empty. Clearly, it was time to take matters into my own hands. Finding a new hiding place was easy. I constructed a box for my girls and hid it in a shoe rack in my closet. For a second, I wondered why Anne Frank's Barbie wasn't here, but then I dismissed it. Her clothes were too boring. My Barbies were safe in their new sanctuary, but Ethan still needed punishment. It wasn't even about Malibu Dream Barbies anymore. There was one place in the house where I was safe from the noise and mess of my brothers. One place where I could shut out the rest of the world. One place where I felt safe. And Ethan invaded it, stole from it, ruined my bed. And now he had to pay. Ethan was 6 years older than me, weighed twice as much as me, and was at least a foot taller, so beating him was out of the question. Getting revenge took strategy, not strength. Brains, not brawn. Determination, not teeth. And if it was truly effective, Ethan must never find out it was me. My mind was spinning with the thought of what his revenge on me might be. Maybe he'd go after my fingers. It took a few weeks, but I finally came up with a plan. Ethan had football practice every afternoon and most Saturdays. He would come home tired, throw his sweaty jersey, stinky cleats, and dirty pads in the living room, and then stagger to the kids' bathroom where he would shower and dry himself off with his towel, a black sheet that hung outside the bathroom door. 2 weeks after Malibu Dream Barbie lost her toes, I headed to the bathroom at 5 o'clock, about a half hour before Ethan usually got home from practice. But this time, instead of toilet paper, I used Ethan's towel, and I wiped myself thoroughly. By the time Ethan finished screaming, half the family was in the bathroom, and the other half in the hallway. He was crying and still wiping the brown streaks on his face with the towel, which only made them worse. Dad led Logan and Brendan out into the hallway while Mom whispered to him and tried to take the towel away. Dad closed the door. My parents never figured out which one of us did it. We were all suspects. As the oldest child, Ethan ruled with an iron fist, and I wasn't the only one struggling under his not-so-friendly dictatorship. We all had motive and opportunity. Unable to find a better solution, Mom and Dad resorted to the standard, "You're in trouble now" punishment of the highest order. They sent us all to bed early and told us there would be no dessert this week. In retrospect, I'm not surprised my brothers didn't think twice about trashing the house. My parents were really bad at discipline. That night, lying in bed, I felt I had my revenge, and I had gotten away with it. I remembered Ethan's sobs and smiled. Who was a crybaby now? Over the next week, both of my parents apologized to me for the punishment. They knew, of course, that there was no way their little princess could have pulled such a cruel prank on my brother, but they needed to be fair, and they punished me along with my siblings. I assured them I understood and stoically accepted my punishment, trying hard not to smirk at my brother's complaints about the missing desserts. For one thing, my revenge was futile. Streaks of shit on Ethan's face weren't going to get Barbie back on his feet or make him stop chewing on my dolls. He'll still do things that piss me off, and if I'm not vigilant, he might even destroy another one of my dolls. He will always be stronger. He'll always have cooler toys. But on this one night, everything was fair. The scales were even. I was in charge. Over time, that feeling passed, but I still felt a slight thrill every time I saw Ethan's new white towel. Over the next few years, my brothers would periodically break into my room, and I would always retaliate. Sometimes textbooks would go missing the night before a vital exam, or toothbrushes would taste oddly like toilet bowl cleaner. Balancing the scales of justice was exciting, but also scary. I loved the creative, evil ideas that crept into my brain, but the more I indulged them, the more they pushed me around. I realized that if I didn't watch out for them, these little pranks could be the first steps on the road to becoming a monster. I wondered if that's how Jeffrey Dahmer felt when he first skinned a cat. Next chapter. In college, it was easier to ignore my brilliant ideas of revenge. To begin with, I was busy. The economics program was rigorous, and I was one of the only girls, so I felt obligated to kick ass in my classes. Besides, the environment was much simpler. While the girls in my dorm weren't going to win any cleanliness awards, there's a difference between 4 dirty brothers and 28 girls who were still honing their cleaning routines. But after Christmas break my freshman year, I became a kinder, gentler person. My roommate Holly Elkins, frustrated by her boyfriend's absence, dropped out and was replaced by Danielle. Call me Danny. Steinberg. Danny was the classic simpering hippie girl, both in personality and overall body shape. But inside, I discovered, lurked a mean girl. Danny was messy in just about every way in which one can be messy. Within a week, her clothes were strewn across every flat surface in our dorm room, making it impossible to find her textbooks, paper, pens, calculator, all the things she needed to be a real student. That meant she was borrowing mine. Basically, Danny thought that everything that belonged to me was ours, and everything that belonged to her was flooring. God knows I tried to get along with her. Opening the door to the mess, I pulled a smile on my face and started packing. After a couple weeks of this routine, I began to feel like an otter I saw once at the zoo. The water in his enclosure was warm and murky, and he was compulsively swirling around in it, desperately trying to clean himself. Watching him, I felt a kinship. I realized he was going crazy, swirling around trying to wash himself clean, even as fresh mud clogged his fur. Life with Danny was like that. Only, unlike the otter, I had a little evil part of my mind coming up with dozens, no, hundreds, devilish ideas for revenge. It was like I had a superpower that I constantly had to shut down so no one would see. I started to think of it as a voice. My little voice of revenge, always ready to offer advice on how to balance the scales of justice. By the end of January, Danny and I had divided the room in half. On one side was a clothes dryer, and on the other was clean enough for surgery. Then the sarcastic comments began. Anyone who has ever lived in a sorority house can attest to the little things, the eye-rolling, the remark about the roommate cleaning again. Soon, we were practically a meme on the floor. Merry Danny and Crazy Ashley. And when I complained about a missing notebook or a missing calculator, eyes would roll. Crazy Ashley comments would pop up, and my stock would drop just a little bit more. In a few short weeks, Danny had turned our floor from a boring freshman dorm into a mix of Mean Girls and Lord of the Flies, and I was Piggy. Despite this, I kept my vengeance voice under lock and key. I could handle the mess, the sarcasm, the petty thefts, and the eye-rolling. After all, the semester was only a few months away, and then I'd be rid of Fun Danny for good. And then the pink scrunchie happened. Girls in the hallway wore scrunchies on their doorknobs to indicate that one of their roommates was receiving a guest. With Holly carrying the torch for her hometown boyfriend, this wasn't a problem, but with Danny, pink scrunchie became a serious workout, and I soon found myself spending most of my time in the study room. I tried to find a middle ground in my relationship with the arrogant Jezebel, who had opened a brothel in my house. I suggested setting up a regular schedule for her to maintain the parade of makeup-clad scholars, poets, baristas, and couriers she let in and out every now and then. Or perhaps I suggested she could try outdoor activities. When my attempts at detente failed to thaw the Cold War in the room, I tried to beat her at her own game. I bought myself a pink scrunchie and hung it on the door so I could carve out a few hours to study at my desk. Even so, under Danny's relentless onslaught, I spent most of my time in exile in the study hall. Perhaps we would have stayed that way, exchanging scratches, vying for control of the room, had it not been for my first big test on world economics. Unfortunately, it was scheduled for the day after one of Danny's marathon days, which meant I wasn't allowed to get to my textbooks and notes. After waiting in the break room for 3 hours, I got fed up and committed a cardinal sin. I ignored the pink scrunch. I expected to see Danny, but her bed was empty. I wondered for a second if she had already left and just forgot to bring her scrapbooking with her. Then I caught some movement on my side of the room, and it took my brain a moment to realize what I was seeing. Danny turned her head. "Get out!" she shouted. "Screw you!" I yelled back. "Not on my damn desk!" I grabbed a can of Lysol from the nightstand and started spraying. My desk, my book, Danny! I screamed. He screamed. She, stumbling to the floor, followed him, and I splayed her as she walked out the door. It was done. At that moment, the little ballsy part of my brain that came up with cool ideas for pranks stopped whispering and started screaming. I ignored the first wave of ideas. Bengay and her lotion. Well, lots of Bengay. And superglue. I waited. I tried to calm down. And once I calmed down, I started planning. My revenge was going to be sneaky. Danny's smartass remarks had already gotten me labeled as a weirdo in the hallway, and our altercation had put us both on probation, and any further infraction could get me expelled. Fortunately, I knew how to be sneaky. Another interesting fact, in my college's student health department, antibiotics were handed out like candy, and the girls in my hallway often dropped them halfway through. Getting amoxicillin tablets was easier than buying a beer. One last interesting fact. When antibiotics are mixed with juice, they become almost tasteless. I had already noticed that berry blue was Danny's favorite Gatorade flavor. Whenever I loaded a multi-pack in the fridge, they were the first to disappear. When Danny finished her course of antibiotics, she was healthy as a horse. By the end of February, the low-budget brothel was closed. By the end of freshman year, we could barely see each other without it turning into a screaming fight. Next chapter. So, a little time to clarify a few things. First of all, let's talk about my little voice of revenge. For the record, I want it to be known that it's my voice, not some demon or the neighbor's dog or some other crap. I have some issues, obviously, but multiple personality disorder, schizophrenia, and borderline personality disorder are not among them. As for the classic trio, attention deficit disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and autism, well, the jury is still out on that one. I've never taken the tests because I really don't want to see what the results will be. You don't have to be Freud to realize that I have classic symptoms of all three disorders, and I don't at all want to become another crazy person whose problems are rolled up into a convenient diagnosis. I've made bad decisions. I've done stupid things. And as far as I'm concerned, everything else, overwork, insecurity, AD, OCD, and so on, Well, those are just excuses. One of the positive aspects of my time in the study lounge was getting to know Mickey Collins, a similarly high school student who was also into organization and had a roommate who gave it away for free to half the campus. We ended up living together for the rest of college. And while we fought a few times about classifying our spices, alphabetically, not by kitchen, she was kind enough not to comment on the fact that I categorized my underwear by color, age, and material. I think that's why we're still friends to this day. Anyway, we settled in together at the beginning of sophomore year. By Christmas, I even started dating. I soon discovered the joy and the misery of relationships. Most college guys, I discovered, were a lot like my brothers, at least as far as running a household was concerned. Being enlightened millennial males, they didn't expect me to clean up after them. However, they also didn't feel that their enlightened feminism somehow obligated them to clean up after themselves, so spending time with most of them meant wallowing in filth. After college, I went into finance, which fulfilled my need for order. Numbers always add up. 1 plus 1 always equals 2, no matter how many zeros come after the ones. And while there is a little room for maneuvering when it comes to things like insider trading or creative accounting, we're all generally well aware of where the moral and legal boundaries lie. Money also has no conscience, and that appeals to my sense of balance as well. After all, if you're an idiot, or if your advisor is an idiot and you don't have the sense to fire him, you probably deserve to lose your money. Watching my clients prosper while other investors failed fed the part of me that believed in rewarding virtue and punishing vice. I may have been the only person in the world who cheered for Bernie Madoff. If you were stupid and rich enough to invest with this guy, you clearly need to get a real job. If you're in finance and ambitious, you want to end up on Wall Street. However, given my obsession with hygiene and a strong, albeit idiosyncratic, sense of right and wrong, there was no way I was going to get a job at Salomon Brothers or one of the other fraternal Wall Street firms. Instead, I ended up at Pierce, Bateman, Green, Potter, and McDuke, a prim, prissy investment firm that had the best employee retention rate on Wall Street. Part of that was due to the office environment. Instead of relying on fear, harassment, forcing their brokers to work 100+ hours a week, at Pierce, Bateman utilized cool planning, ample staffing, and unbridled greed. We still worked long hours, 60-hour weeks were common, but nothing like the burnout at other firms. And while our starting salaries were much lower, things leveled off as we moved up the ladder. But even more than that, Pierce and Bateman was looking for employees who were willing to look to the future. People who were ready to look forward to a long and successful career, rather than a short and brutal fight for this year's pot of gold. People who wanted to start a family and sought the professional stability to make that possible. That stability worked both ways. Instead of the drunken orgies rumored at other companies, Pierce Bateman hosted relaxed, collegial happy hours on Thursdays where we loosened our ties, metaphorical ties in my case, and got to know each other. Spouses were strongly encouraged to attend. Admittedly, Pierce, the family atmosphere at Bateman, was more reminiscent of the Corleones than the Cleavers. And as one of the few female employees who didn't have a boyfriend, much less a husband, I felt like a bit of a perpetual Frito. Still, I was part of the family and had good company. The Pierce, Bateman's low-key approach allowed them to hire the best. Well, except for Winslow Hubble. In a way, Winslow had everything Pierce and Bateman were looking for. He was well-dressed and affable, with the manners and banter of a schoolboy. He also had the requisite list of wealthy friends and relatives, many of whom undoubtedly wanted to join the ranks of our clients. On the other hand, he was stunningly incompetent. I'm sure one of his college professors must have made him look at the profit and loss statement, but as far as Winslow was concerned, he might as well have been speaking Urdu. And when it came to the jargon of our business, I once overheard a partner ask Winslow about the company's EBITDA. EBITDA is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, and it's one of the first metrics you check when you're researching a company. Anyway, Winslow paused, chuckled condescendingly, and said he wasn't sure. He'd never drunk domestic beer. The poor partner just stood there blinking. There was talk around the campfire that Winslow got his job thanks to his mom and dad. While I wasn't sure how true that was, I knew for a fact that the senior Hubbles had invested over $100 million in the firm. Moreover, I was one of the fund analysts tasked with making sure their money continued to grow at a healthy rate. On the surface, hiring Winslow was a monumental failure, but after working at Pierce, Bateman for a while, I realized that it was actually a masterful move. For the rest of the worker bees, Winslow was like a trophy, a visual reminder of what we were all fighting for. Sure, we didn't want to be his likeness. My goodness, he looked like 200 pounds of horseradish and mashed potatoes roughly molded into the likeness of a human being. But he was proof of what we could accomplish. If we work hard enough, make enough money, build enough strong clients, kiss enough ass, well, maybe our kids will be incompetent, bumbling morons and still be able to make six figures. Hell, that's the American dream, right? Despite the company's ban on working too long hours, I still managed to spend about 80 hours a week at my desk. I had nothing to do. When it came to dating, New York was a little better than college. Some men were a little neater. But if I wanted someone to woo, it looked like I'd have to settle for an older man. I decided to put the problem to rest and put up with the long hours at work and the occasional one-night stand. I decided that when my marital status started to interfere with my advancement, I would find an older guy who could clean up after himself. Well, or I'll look at mail-order grooms. Maybe Ireland is exporting? As for finding random one-night stands, Mickey Collins was a lifesaver. She lived in the city too, and dragged me to all the tacky, sweaty music venues around New York City. In fact, that's how I met my husband Charlie. We were at a We Were Promised Jetpacks concert, and I was carrying 2 solo cups filled with overpriced Budweiser when the crowd shoved it my way. I zigged when I should have zagged, and ended up with one of the beers on it. Luckily, it was my beer that ended up on Charlie's shirt. If things had turned out differently, we might never have talked, much less gotten married. I know this about myself, and I'm not proud of it. He was amazingly nice about it, much nicer than I would have been. And when he told me that I'd wet his 3rd favorite shirt, so I definitely owed him a dance, I knew this was someone I should take seriously. I discovered that most people don't sort their t-shirts very carefully, and I began to appreciate those who do. Of course, dancing was also a plus. When I saw Charlie's apartment 2 weeks later, I knew I had fallen in love. Everything was from IKEA, from the screamy LED lights to the scub drawer organizers. I also admired the way he rolled up his socks and arranged them by color. Not that I'll admit to looking in his drawers. Lots of things. And while he was willing to put up with the standard series of boring conversations and corporate bragging, he seemed to truly blossom after he met Marty Hubble, Winslow's wife. Watching their conversation at the corner table, I sometimes felt a prick of jealousy, but mostly I was grateful for a husband who was willing to work so hard to help my career. He even allowed me to invite almost his entire office to our wedding, which took place about a year after we met. On the work front, the wedding was also a boon. When the ring came along, I had already been working as a junior analyst for 3 years, which was putting me on a deadline for a promotion to full analyst. The promotion came 2 months after the ring. I want to be clear. Although Charlie helped me at work, that's not why I fell in love with him, and it's certainly not why I married him. Why did I fall in love with Charlie? It's another place where I wanted to be a better writer. With him, I was either wild and outrageous, or rude and athletic, or yes, buttoned up and organized. I was more than I thought I could be, and he was more with me too. There was something between us that had no name. As vulgar as it sounds, I felt complete. I had a man who saw all of me and still loved me. A man who soothed my wounds and supported my weakness. There are no words for it, and those terms you hear. My other half. The wind beneath my wings, the yin to my yang, don't even reflect how deep it felt to be part of the Charlie and Ashley couple. It was safe. It was exciting. It was like it turned up the volume on the world, making everything more real. Which is why, 2 years after Winslow, Charlie remains the only man. The only man I've ever loved, and the only man I can imagine. And yes, Given how this story began, the irony is not lost on me. Next chapter. Of course, we still had pitfalls and obstacles. Just because I fell in love, learned a lot, and married the man of my dreams doesn't mean I became a different person, or that my destructive tendencies magically disappeared. Quite the opposite. When you pack two determined, somewhat obsessive cleaners into a 400 square foot apartment, essentially a 20-foot square box, you have some friction. Add to that two high-pressure jobs that left Charlie and I exhausted by the end of the day, and then add the lack of time to clean up during the week. This is not a recipe for domestic bliss. I kept a close eye on my need to control, but completely overlooked a more important, and ultimately more damaging, trend. Over time, as I channeled all my energies into climbing the hill to senior analyst, I began to see Charlie as my life support system. When I came home from work, he was the person who kept me energized. When I needed help with a project, a different perspective on a problem, someone to run a last-minute errand, or just give me a hug and make me forget about everything in the world, he was there. He was there everywhere. Taking care of me wasn't Charlie's responsibility, but he took it upon himself and I let him. I started to forget that loving me was something Charlie chose to do, not something he was paid to do. And when I forgot that, I started to love myself a lot less. And that's how the pants episode happened. Next chapter. First, let's get this straight. The pants episode wasn't entirely my fault. When you have two clean-cut weirdos living in a tiny apartment, it goes without saying that you end up with a pretty strict housekeeping routine. Every Saturday morning, we combed the apartment from top to bottom, and every 2 months we did a real purge. We'd take a few bags to the dumpster, a few bags to Goodwill, and then shake our brains out in the middle of the newly vacated, freshly vacuumed living room floor. It was one of my favorite traditions. The morning in question was cleaning day. It started with us turning in a huge load of laundry to the laundromat, which meant both of our laundry bags were involved. 3 of my favorite dresses needed to be taken to the dry cleaners, and with no laundry bags, I put them in a garbage bag. Yeah, I know. What kind of idiot puts her favorite dresses in a garbage bag on trash day? But even so, did it never occur to Charlie to check the bags before throwing them in Goodwill? Yes, Dr. Thompson, I know. Shifting the blame. I was burdening my husband with a heavy workload on Saturday morning. Checking the bags was my job. But still. And yes, I overreacted. Perhaps I shouldn't have yelled at him. And when he ran out of the apartment, a smart person, a rational person, might have realized she was a little overreacting. A rational person would have stopped there. And no, I wasn't rational. In retrospect, I definitely shouldn't have waited until he was asleep and then thrown away all 12 pairs of his pants. And the next morning when he texted asking where his pants were, I also shouldn't have texted back, "Check at Goodwill." The smirking emoji was too drastic a move. So yes, I bear most of the blame. Most of the blame. Maybe even all of the blame. But in my defense, there was a bright side to this pants fiasco. Charlie had a lot of gaudy pants from Uniqlo and H&M before the purge. Colored jeans, shiny polyester pants. Sure, his job wasn't up to the same standards as mine, but you dress for the job you want, and his Uniqlo chinos said his dream job was working at the post office. Yeah, I know. Look, it's hard to get away with making excuses. I ended up undermining my husband's trust and ruining our marriage. And that's not the worst part. The worst part was that the pants episode triggered something in me. It had been years since the Donnie Steinberg incident. Years during which I had kept most of myself on a leash. And while I was appalled by my behavior, some part of me, a bigger part than I'd like to admit, felt like it had been let out of prison. In retrospect, I can say that Charlie took the whole pants thing incredibly calmly. He probably would have been entitled to walk out the door, or at least show up to my work happy hour in cropped sweatpants. But no, he bought himself new pants, had them tailored, and dutifully walked into 3 Olives, looking like the perfect model of the modern male financier. Apologies to Gilbert and Sullivan, of course. But while things seemed to be getting better, there were still problems bubbling beneath the surface. We should have talked about it. Instead, Charlie treated me silently for 4 days. It was effective. He was a talkative man, and his silence was louder than most people's screams. Without words, it told me that he was seriously angry. The only thing I didn't realize until much later was how deep that anger was. Still, I slowed down. I didn't stop completely. After all, the little revenge voice was free, and he was hungry. Instead, I started looking for little things to punish him for, and then pulling little pranks to even out the scales. Filling the sugar bowl with salt. Stealing the book he was reading. Taking all the marshmallows from his Lucky Charms. Little revenge for little things. Over time, we slowly returned to normal, or at least the new normal. Replenishing our closet for a couple months wiped out all our expenses, and we had to look for free activities. Or rather, I had to look. As punishment, I took it upon myself to plan our calendar. I discovered free concerts in Central Parks and tracked down the best musical acts on the subway. $2.75 subway fare for live music. I sought out weird little museums all over the city and tracked down their free admission days like I was a Catholic mom with 10 kids and 5 bedrooms. We picnicked in cemeteries and lounged afternoons on city beaches. We talked and laughed and discussed our big dreams and our least favorite foods and the fact that most modern art is a joke. We became closer than ever. And then Caitlin Kahn happened. Next chapter. I won't even pretend that my reaction to Caitlin was rational. When I met her at a 5K race sponsored by Charlie's company, she launched voices I didn't even know existed. There was my familiar voice of revenge, plus the voice of jealousy, the voice of insecurity. A totally freaking irrational voice. The thing is, Caitlin was really nice. She was a little shy and seemed to feel a little awkward in her thin sweatshirt and tights. I think she pointed out at least 3 times that these were not the usual thick sweaters and corduroy pants she wears to the office. And I was very nice too. Handling the money of annoying old preppies, I knew how to put a nice smile on my face when talking to people I could happily gut. Caitlin and I chatted about all sorts of silly things. Where she bought her shoes and where she went to school, how long she'd been running, and what the best diner in her neighborhood was. Standard, superficial conversation between a devoted wife and her husband's friendly coworker. But beneath the surface, I was seething. Watching Caitlin, I felt jealousy and vulnerability. Looking at her, I saw the fragility of the shelter Charlie and I had built. I wanted to lock the doors, to board up the windows, hide my Barbies. I'd been to Charlie's office Christmas parties and met his coworkers, but that's when I first realized, really, deeply realized, that he had a whole other life besides me. A beautiful woman who looked up to him. Colleagues who relied on him. A job that mattered to a lot of people. At Pierce Bateman, Charlie was the handyman who came to weekly happy hours to support me. Every Thursday, he watched me flirt and make my way through a crowd of men who were pretty hot. If you liked strong chins, expensive suits, and inflated egos. He knew everything about my world, from the pet names of my coworkers to the due dates of my projects. God, when I think of how much time he spent talking to Winslow with a fake smile on his face while that slimeball was humbled and not so humbled, I think maybe Charlie deserves a Nobel Prize. Or at least sainthood. But when it came to his work, I was the absentee wife. I didn't know if his company had happy hours or if he attended them. I didn't know about his work projects or even what he was doing. And then a horrible thought occurred to me. What if the only reason we'd gone to the Central Park race that day was because I was a runner and Charlie knew I'd have fun? I felt the blood rush from my face. What did it say about our relationship that I only came to his events when I liked them? I thought I heard thunder in the distance, a storm on the horizon, threatening to destroy my perfect life. Watching Charlie with Caitlin, I realized that my willingness to overlook half of Charlie's life had left the door open to potential predators. A smart person, a rational person would have taken advantage of the red flag and looked a little deeper into her husband's work life. As for me, all I could focus on was the fact that a beautiful woman was casting masculine glances at my husband and he wasn't pushing her away. My jealous side was saying, "Oh man, no!" And my little revenge side was hatching the idea of cutting her hair, one strand at a time. No scissors. As for my rational side, she seemed to be packing for a trip to Rio. As we walked back to the apartment, I stared at Charlie in silence. I'm sure he could see my anger in the angle of my jaw and the stiffness of my stride. When we finally talked, he'd done everything right, minimized his relationship with Caitlin, talked about how much he loved me, flirted until I was, well, not happy, but at least calmed down. How did he put up with me? How could he tolerate my behavior? Even after 2 years with Dr. Thompson, I still can't figure it out. When I got home, I did exactly what you would expect a jealous, immature, guilty wife to do. I had fun with him. Maybe I hoped I'd leave him so devastated that he'd have nothing left to give to Caitlin or the other women in his office. I decided to pay more attention to my husband, and in the meantime, remind him of where he belongs. Charlie's behavior in the weeks that followed didn't reassure me, but I'm not sure there's anything to reassure. The voice of vengeance went crazy, reminding me over and over again of how Caitlin looked at him like a munificent cow. Not to mention the way she and Marty Hubble huddled together at happy hour, or the admiring look he got from the barista at our neighborhood Starbucks. Having seen one threat, I now saw them everywhere. And yet, I hung in there. Until Hell Week. Next chapter. Once a year, Charlie's office would go into overdrive as they rushed to publish the company's annual report. His team would suddenly go from an 8-hour workday to a 12-hour day or even longer. I knew it was coming, but I wasn't prepared for the visual reminder that Charlie's world extended beyond our apartment. Our marriage. On the first day of Hell Week, Charlie came home about 4 hours late and looked terrible. The last shreds of my rational side whispered that his dirty clothes, 1,000-yard stare, and obvious fatigue were all indicative of a long, brutal day at work. Meanwhile, jealous me stood there with a mouthpiece and shouted that being exhausted and being well entertained are very similar. And the not-so-rational me, the new girl who showed up around the day of Charlie's 5K, heard the thunder, felt another earthquake roll through our cozy, comfortable oasis, and finally lost my temper. I still blush when I think of my poor husband, wobbly on his feet as I scolded him for coming home late from work. How many times had I come home 1, 2, 3 hours late, irritated and tired, demanding that he please me? It doesn't matter. I'd heard the rumbling, seen his cloudy eyes, and was in no mood to reason straight. Before I let him crawl into bed, I made him promise that no matter what, he would respond to my messages within 10 minutes. But even then, I knew I was going to extreme measures. God, I was confused. But here's the thing, and I'm pretty sure I'm not blaming the victim. I wasn't alone in this. Charlie was there too. That week. I mean, that first night. Would have been a very good time for him to talk to me about my behavior. Maybe he should have told me I was acting crazy. Or for that matter, he could have pulled out a pair of pants and just thrown me a meaningful look. Maybe he should have suggested I see a counselor. Or maybe he should have just yelled at me. I was counting on Charlie to provide a happy, stable home for us, even if it led to conflict. Perhaps that's unfair, but it's also true. Sometimes, I think, loving someone means telling them to clean up their act. But instead of calling me to order, Charlie did his best to placate me, which in turn fueled the beast. Looking back, I realized that he was so malleable because he cared about our relationship, but at the time, I wondered if he was giving in so quickly because he was tormented by his conscience. I had no way of finding out what was going on in Charlie's office. Hiring a private investigator would have been too expensive, and other options like hacking into his cell phone, bugging his backpack, or installing a keylogger on his laptop weren't very useful either. After all, any communication with Caitlin was going to have to be face-to-face, away from the nearest convenient recording device. The only real solution was to become Charlie's probation officer, which I did. I texted him constantly, trying to catch him in the act. When he kept texting me back, I should have calmed down. After all, he clearly wasn't cheating on me, right? But no, I still couldn't shake the suspicion that somehow, some way, he was still managing to have fun with someone behind my back. Instead of dispelling my doubts, each of his replies only reinforced them. In the morning, when Charlie finally didn't show up, I was almost relieved. Suddenly, all the tension was gone. There was no reason to worry anymore, no reason to hold back the lust for revenge. Charlie had made his decision, and all that was left was to devise a plan to restore balance. Next chapter. From what I've heard, people usually cheat because they don't respect their spouses, or they seek control, or they have some sort of, oh my god, I'm getting old, and I need to entertain some strange guy pearl-clutching syndrome. None of those options applied to me. Well, maybe I had control issues. Okay, maybe I had a lot of control issues. I saw Charlie as my man and taking care of me as his job. And I didn't feel cared for, so I took it upon myself to balance the scales. Yeah, maybe there was a respect issue here too. Of course, I didn't see any of that at the time. All I saw was a husband who didn't socialize with the woman and a few unaccounted for hours in the office. An office that was full of closets and empty conference rooms. An office just a couple blocks from the Liberty Inn, an hourly hotel on the west side that claimed to be the backwater of New York City. How long had it been since Charlie and I had visited the Liberty? Since the pants episode? And how hard would it have been for him and Caitlin to go out and get laid? And since we haven't had any afternoon pleasures, how likely is it that he's burning the sheets with a strange woman in a hotel we know nothing about? Hell yes, the jury exclaimed with glee, their verdict unanimous. Burn him. Burn it. Restore the balance. But even as I decided that balance had to be restored, I realized that having an affair wasn't that easy. I didn't want to turn things the other way. I already felt bad enough that Charlie was cheating on me. Us. But if I were to have fun with someone else, things would get complicated. Then I would be the cheater, and Charlie would be justifiably vengeful towards me. And that would start the cycle. This wasn't about destroying my marriage. This was about saving it. At least that's what I told myself. There were logistical issues, too. My job had me chained to my desk, so I couldn't go trotting around the financial district looking for someone to take home. What if I couldn't control my new lover? What if he passed something on to me? So many variables, so much clutter. God, I hate clutter. I've heard that a lot of romances start in the office. It's not hard to see why. There's opportunity, temptation, interaction, and lots of horizontal surfaces. If I were looking for a real romance, if I wanted to cheat on my husband, maybe develop feelings for someone else, generally have my world rocked, my office would be a universal place to shop. While Pierce, Bateman had no physical fitness requirements or minimum hair products for employees, the office was full of gym rats with heads full of high-end protein gels and curl creams. Trouble is, the place was also full of egomaniacs, the kind who claim that they are the ones who decide whether to start or end an affair, and whether or not to throw it in a cuckold's face. The kind of egotists who delighted in conquering a woman and were prone to whispering about it in the office and at weekly get-togethers. The kind of egotists who wouldn't hesitate to destroy my career and marriage for bragging rights. I needed to find a puppet, a guy I could control, who would be happy to get some weirdness, who wouldn't interfere with my emotions, and who I would have no problem dumping when the time came. Ideally, someone from the office. I needed Winslow Hubble. He was perfect, unattractive, not too smart, a total badass with a lot to lose, and not smart enough to realize I had a lot to lose. Plus, screwing him would make Marty Hubble a head shorter. At least in my mind. Just like that, 6 days later, I found myself staring at the ceiling, wondering if my husband had replaced the smoke detector. Next chapter. Sometimes you hear about cheaters who don't expect to get caught and are surprised when their loving husband or wife starts yelling, screaming, and throwing things. That's not about me. On some level, I guess I always expected Charlie to get caught. I imagined he'd get upset with me. I'd retaliate by lashing out at him with rage about Caitlin and Marty. We'd have the big fight we so desperately needed. and eventually return to some sort of equilibrium. I'll dump Winslow, Charlie will calm down about Caitlin and Marty, and we'll move on together. It was a beautiful dream. I'd bet everything on Charlie's endless love for me, his reasonableness, his willingness to work things out. I never imagined that he would just end my relationship. But that's exactly what he did. And this time, I didn't have a backup plan. When Charlie sent me that video of me and Winslow, I almost lost my lunch. It was so disgusting. Was Charlie laughing at me? Was he crying? The embarrassment lasted a few minutes, and then I was filled with anger. How dare Charlie throw Winslow in my face? How dare he threaten me with divorce over this? Didn't he know the ordeal I'd gone through to keep us together? How hard was it to find a way to forgive his cheating without compromising myself? Oh my God. The fact that I let that filthy bastard inside of me? Just because Charlie had a video and I didn't, how the hell could he hold a high position? I felt like I was on fire, burning with anger. And to make matters worse, Charlie hadn't even deigned to stay home where I could yell at him, threaten him, attack him, cry on him, make him love me. That first night, I broke a few things. Okay, I broke a lot of things, including most of our dishes, glassware, framed pictures, and an umbrella. And then, being me, I cleaned it all up. I'm sure there are many people who can completely lose themselves in a destructive rage and then collapse on the couch and eat a pint of Ben & Jerry's. I'm not one of them. The only thing I didn't do was touch his clothes. We were long past the point where a few pairs of disappearing pants could balance the scales. My rational voice whispered that I'd thrown us off balance, but I drowned it out, buried it under several tons of rage and self-justification, peed on the grave, and set the cemetery on fire. Then I sent Charlie a bunch of angry texts and phone calls. Then I got drunk. Then I sent a few more phone messages that were more sentimental than angry. Then I went to bed. The next week was a living hell. I felt like the ugliest kid in Siberia. I missed Charlie. It was like a physical illness. My skin ached from his touch. My stomach clenched. I felt empty inside, as empty as his side of the bed. My chest felt empty, hollow. I felt like I was being blown around by the wind. Charlie didn't respond to my texts, phone calls, emails, and WhatsApp messages. He deleted me from my friends on Instagram, Facebook, and Snapchat. I thought about bugging him at his office, but his building had multiple entrances, so he could easily dodge me. I called his mom, who was clearly cool, and his dad, who didn't even bother to answer the phone. And then it hit me. I had met several of his friends over the years, but never bothered to get their contact information. As if I needed another reminder of how absent-minded a wife I was. I remembered Charlie's silence during those days when I'd thrown his pants away, and my horror intensified. This guy could teach my parents a lesson in punishment. There was nothing worse than him turning his back on me. I'd always been the more coldly calculating of the two of us, but after Winslow, Charlie had put me in an awkward position. With a few surgical incisions, he'd carefully cut himself out of my life. The day after he left, I came home from work and found his belongings missing. A week later, a bailiff stood on my doorstep with a manila envelope in hand. Charlie wanted to take half of our joint savings and a few belongings from the apartment. We would keep our own retirement accounts, and he offered to let me keep all the furniture. It was a fair deal, perhaps even a generous one. It's the kind of deal one offers when they want to get things over with quickly. I was furious. I went back to his parents, but I got nothing. Charlie talked to my parents, and they weren't much help either. Dad said he was disappointed in me, and Mom cried. I wondered if they were trying to figure out a way to send me to my room and deprive me of dessert. I didn't have enough money to hire a good lawyer, but I did everything I could to delay, waiting until the last minute to respond to his divorce petition, demanding a hearing, demanding counseling. I couldn't stop the process, but I slowed it down. All I wanted, I told his lawyer, was contact, a chance to talk. After 2 months of procrastination, I got what I wanted. Charlie wrote me a letter. Dear Ashley. He used my full name. I'm trying to do this the easy way. I still love you. I think I always will. But I can't erase the memories of seeing you with Winslow. And even if I could, I can't spend the next 50 or 60 years wondering when, not if, I'm going to piss you off again. And I certainly can't live in fear of what you'll do for your next revenge. In 2 years, you've gone from destroying my pants to destroying my faith in you. I cringe at the thought of what you might destroy next time. I've tried to be soft on this issue. I've told both of our families that you did something that irreparably destroyed our marriage. While I'm sure they could fill in the blanks, I didn't do it for them. I also didn't show the video to anyone. What's more, I didn't even watch the last one. After I watched one, I didn't need to watch anything else. So here goes. Sign the papers. If you don't sign, I'll dig up both videos and let our families and friends know exactly what caused the breakup of our marriage. And my explanation will be well illustrated. Let's part mercifully. Let's rebuild our lives. Let me go. Charlie.
Evan!
I'm sure I should have realized a lot of things from this, but primarily that Charlie never got to see my last day with Winslow. I blushed at the thought of him watching, and felt a strange sense of relief that he hadn't seen the worst of it. Sure, I didn't like the thought of my parents, in-laws, friends, and co-workers seeing me rolling around in bed with Winslow, but I knew I could get through it. The hardest part would be Charlie. It was enough that he'd seen me with Winslow, but to see it on the last day, it was a humiliation I don't think I could take. And then there was Charlie threatening me. This was the man who had let me destroy his closet, who had given so much of himself to help my career, who had made my world so much bigger. I knew he was telling the truth when he said he loved me, but he was also telling the truth when he said he would destroy me if I continued to fight for a divorce. That's when I realized this wasn't a tactic, a prank, or a negotiation. Charlie was going to leave me. I was going to be alone, more alone than I had ever been before, if only because I now knew what it meant not to be alone. I felt something crumble inside me, like I was exploding or shrinking into myself, as if the emptiness had finally eaten me whole. I wrote him back. Dear Charlie, you win. If you promise to destroy the videotapes, I'll sign. Love, your Ash. His answer was short. Ashley, I promise. Charlie. I signed the papers. A few months later, we divorced. Next chapter. Epilogue. Once I accepted the inevitable, the divorce was easy. Charlie let me keep the apartment, half the money, and most of the furniture, at least what was left after my tantrum. I ended up moving in with Mickey Collins in a nice, ultra-modern apartment in Battery Park City. It was close to work, and the neighborhood was beautiful in the spirit of Logan's Run and a utopian future. All in all, it was exactly how I envisioned Toronto. And yet I missed our cozy little neighborhood, the Zabar's store on the corner, the old Irish bar on the next street. Most of all, I missed Charlie.
Sim.
I found out later that he had moved in with his friend Aaron in Jackson Heights, and then got his own place there. On the one hand, it was Queens, so I clearly won. On the other hand, I sometimes imagine Charlie in Little India, Little Thailand, or Little Mexico, wandering through curry stores, street sari stores, and open-air markets. On amazing adventures. Without me. And that's when I realized I had lost. I rushed to work, running inside as soon as the doors opened and staying there until the janitors escorted me out. I told myself I came early because my commute to work was now a 15-minute walk, and I left late because there wasn't much nightlife in Battery Park City. Lying to myself was easier than admitting that I had made work my life because I had ruined my real life. Winslow had been trying to date me for months, but it was easy for me to talk him out of it. I said I didn't want to mess up the divorce case, that I wasn't ready, that work had gotten me down, that I was depressed. All the standard excuses. And he, being Winslow, would nod his head, say, yes, that's reasonable. And look at me with puppy dog eyes, letting me know what he wanted. After 6 of our afternoon meals together, the puppy dog eyes had no effect on me. Marty Hubble still came to happy hours at 3 Olives. She seemed normal, but there was a sense of sadness about her. Perhaps it was partly because, with no Charlie to keep her company, she was forced to hang out with the rest of the wannabe trophy wives from Aqua Mist. Sometimes she would look at me, and I could see something in her eyes. Anger? Pity? I hope it was anger. A year after the divorce, Winslow took a vacation. When he returned a month later, he couldn't meet my gaze, or indeed anyone's gaze. Then Marty stopped showing up at the Thursday night socials. From what I heard, they broke up. A few months after Winslow Light showed up at the office, I started dating again. Mickey finally pulled herself together and declared that either I would start my life over or she would look for a new roommate who, and I quote, wouldn't turn on the light every time she opened her mouth. Mickey has a way with words. We went to a few concerts together. Arctic Monkeys at Webster Hall, Gogol Bordello at an establishment in Bushwick, before we ended up at a We Were Promised Jetpacks concert in downtown Brooklyn. I should have known what would happen next. We were promised. Jetpacks weren't that popular, but it still took me by surprise. I ran into him in the smoking area. I was so shocked that I tripped and splashed beer on my t-shirt. I didn't pay any attention to it. When he saw me, his eyebrows went up. I think he was surprised too. For a while we stared at each other, both waiting to see what the other would say. Finally, I interrupted. "Truce?" said I. He smiled. "Truce!" I wiped one of the benches. Sanitary napkins fit easily in my purse, and they're a girl's best friend. Meanwhile, he was watching with a half smile on his face. I threw him a fake look. "You like that, don't you?" The smile blurred. "Even too much. Are you going to take the sidewalk too?" "The ass!" He chuckled. "Well, are you going to sit down or what?" I said. "Still deciding. Is it safe?" I smiled back at him. No germs. We exchanged a few phrases. "Where you are. What you're doing. Did you hear?" He smirked oddly when I mentioned Winslow deflating and Marty leaving. I made a mental note to ask him about it later. Every once in a while, some hipster would come over, and we'd sit down on a bench so that our feet were almost touching. The centimeters separating us were killing me. I felt like I could feel the warmth of his knee on my skin. After a while, we ran out of things to catch up on. 2 years apart had been too full and too empty. For my part, I absorbed that time with long hours at work and grueling hours in therapy. For Charlie, it was visits and explorations filled with hole-in-the-wall restaurants, a bodega, and yes, sari stores in deepest, darkest Queens. That said, no dates, or at least no important dates. Finally, he threw me a look that meant it was time to rip off the Band-Aid. "Why did you do it, Ash?" he asked softly. My heart beat faster when I heard him say my name. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people had called me Ash in my life, but no one could make me feel the way I felt when that tiny word came out of his mouth. I blushed. "You can probably guess," I said, looking down at my hands. I was angry and scared. You were everything to me, and I needed you. And you gave it to me. Then one day I realized you were giving me so much, and I wasn't giving you even close. His face darkened. "You thought you were depriving me and decided to change?" "I don't think that makes sense." I sighed. I knew I was out of balance. We were out of balance. Balance. His eyes sparkled with humor, and for a moment I remembered other nights, other concerts. I was pierced by a pain so intense I froze. "So why didn't you try to balance us out?" he asked. "It would have made sense, wouldn't it?" I tried to smile back at him, but I'm sure I failed. That's exactly what I should have done. But once I realized I had failed you, I began to see danger everywhere. I soon convinced myself that you'd find a better deal. That you'd already found a better deal. A better deal. He snorted. "So did you ever realize I wasn't cheating on you?" "Yes. It was the first week of therapy. And then I realized why we couldn't get over my jealousy." I threw a death glare at the goth girl who was peering at our bench, and she bounced to the side. Whatever you told me back then, Caitlin had a boyfriend, Caitlin had a girlfriend, Caitlin was an android, whatever it was, I wasn't going to believe you. I was so sure I was right, so sure there could be no other answer. I would have ignored anything you said. He looked impressed. And you accomplished that in 1 week of therapy? I grinned unfunny. It took me 3 months to figure that part out. I'm still trying to figure out how things got this far in the first place. Why I sabotaged myself, us, so completely. And what did you come up with? I grinned. Well, it's been 2 years since the divorce, thousands of dollars in therapy, and here's what I came up with. I was definitely in my own little world, was incredibly selfish, and set my marriage on fire. I snorted. What the hell? That's a start. He didn't smile back. But why Winslow? Oh, that's easy. I leaned my back against the wall. Winslow was a joker. He was easy to convince, easy to control, and there was no way he'd give me away. Most of all, I chose him because he was so awful. I knew there was no way I could ever fall in love with him. I gave Charlie another wobbly smile. And I would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for you damn kids. He answered me with a wobbly smile. You know there's no way I could have stayed with you. Not after that. Yeah, your letter made that clear. I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke among the clouds of mango vape. Someone was actually smoking in the smoking area. I wondered if any of the random hipsters were going to call the bouncer. What I don't get is that you never got back at me and Winslow. I can't live with that. I'd have to balance the scales. Balance the scales? Who says I didn't? He looked thoughtful. About a year after our divorce, I met up with Winnie. I had a little time on my hands, and I learned about everything, all his little demons. I laid them out on the table. He grinned. The thing about Winnie is that his whole self-image was built like a house of cards, on favors from his parents, on scandals they kept quiet, on events they arranged. It took me about an hour for it all to come crashing down. That's it? I felt disappointed. Winslow had helped destroy our marriage and he just got a stern talking to? Charlie shrugged. I also gave him a video of you and him together. Let him see himself in action. Let him hear him talk about me. I think I've half convinced him that he's gay. I chuckled. It sounded almost real this time. That explains a lot about what happened to him. He's confused. It's like he's turned into a ghost that haunts the office. The smoking area emptied out. Apparently, the band was going to continue their performance. He deserved it. Charlie's face was stone cold. I also gave Winslow another video. I felt a pain in my gut. Not on the last day. He looked at me. I promised I'd destroy it without looking. I keep my promises. I blushed, and the pain in my stomach rose higher. It wasn't hard to guess what he meant, after all. There was one among us who didn't keep her promises. Through the walls of the smoking area, I heard the sounds of drums. The band was starting up. So, what was that second video? It was me and someone else. And before you ask, I'm not going to tell you who it was. Suffice it to say that I'm pretty sure it ruined Winslow. It wasn't hard to guess who Charlie's partner was. Damn Marty. I felt anger flare up, but I suppressed it. What right did I have to be angry? I left my marriage and he moved on. To goddamn Marty, literally. I took a shaky breath, clenched my hands. He'd said he wasn't seeing anyone else, which meant whatever he had with Marty was probably over. I hoped so. I heard bass through the wall, drums, heavy, pounding. But why didn't you punish me? I asked. After all, I'm the one who betrayed you. Charlie smiled. Yeah, but Winnie was the one who took advantage of a bad situation. He threw me a sharp look. Besides, who says I didn't punish you? I rolled my eyes. Come on, Charlie. You could have torn my life apart. Fire me, ruin my relationship with my parents, destroy all my friendships. You could have made me a leper. But instead, you gave my parents your version of events, handed me a fair divorce settlement, and, as far as I can tell, never said another word about it. He didn't answer for a long time. I listened to the drums and bass as the song came to an end. How do you punish someone you love, Ash? How do you decide what's fair? Balanced? He crossed his legs and stared at the wall for a second. It was the pensive face he made when he was trying to find the perfect words. I missed that look. I saw the video. The one from the 5th day. I saw how bad you felt. But you made it through it anyway. I looked at my hands. They were a blur. I thought I had to. My voice cracked. To balance. He smiled again. But this time the smile was dark. It didn't reach his eyes. You know, I did get a little revenge after all. I froze. You haven't watched The Last Day, have you? Damn it, Ashley, I made a promise. I blushed. I'd never heard him so angry. Then what? What did you do? A new song came on. I heard the bass, the beginning. He looked at me as if deciding whether to say the words. Finally, he squared his shoulders. That last day, I watched the video around 11 o'clock in the morning. Yeah? And I called you at 6:30 that night. I don't understand. The cameras were wired so that when they were activated, I would get a notification on my phone. That last day, the notification came at 5:15. Understanding came. So on the last day, you were able to stop? Yes. I had about 6 hours to stop it. 6 hours where I thought about calling you and letting you off the hook. Thinking about how far you'd go to punish me. Thought about the punishment I deserved. And you let me go through with it. I felt my face redden. For 6 hours. Uh-huh. The song was in full swing. I could almost hear the words. The singer's Scottish accent came through the wall. But why? How? You were acting crazy, Ashley. I couldn't punish you for being crazy. His eyes went hard again. They were so dark, so cold. But that doesn't mean I couldn't let you punish yourself. I shuddered. Winslow's dirty finger, dropping it on the floor, scratching my skin over and over. Charlie could have stopped all of this with a phone call, but he didn't. He decided I needed to be punished, and I couldn't bring myself to honor his request. I felt out of place. I was angry, very angry, and somewhat impressed. In the end, admiration took precedence over anger. Charlie's revenge was exactly what I would have done. He allowed me to trap myself, to punish myself, to humiliate myself, while giving him everything he needed to cut me out of his life. It was evil and brilliant, perfectly balanced and flawlessly executed. The singer shouted out the lyrics. Suddenly, I recognized the song. Quiet Little Voices. I had listened to it with him so many times. Quiet little voices creep into my head. I'm young again. 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 Have I corrupted my husband? Looking at his face, I could see the hidden emotions. He wasn't really proud of what he had done, but he wasn't proud either. He had no regrets. And I realized he didn't have to be. I was playing the revenge game. He played it better. Little silent monsters creep into my head. I'm going to fall in love with you. 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 I wondered where we were going next. Would I see him for the last time? Would we become friends? Friends with benefits? Get married again and get a white picket fence in the suburbs? Become international assassins and overthrow governments? I knew one thing. Whatever I did next, I wanted to do it with Charlie. I wanted to do everything with him. And if I had anything to say about it, he would realize he wanted to do it all with me. But first I realized we had a concert to catch. Luckily, Charlie had other ideas. "Grab your coat!" he growled at me. "We're leaving!" I smiled. Maybe my story would have a happy ending after all. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.